Tina, first, please introduce yourself and tell us how you became involved in the de-radicalization and rehabilitation work.
Thank you very much, Robert and Ioan, for having me. So my name is Tina Mykkänen, and I work in the field of countering and preventing violent extremism and terrorism. And for a number of years now, my main area of focus has been the reintegration of foreign terrorist fighters, returnees, their commitment to the reintegration process, as well as community facilitation of this process. And I'm currently based in Eastern Africa and work regionally on terrorism prevention and consult for UN agencies as well as civil society organizations. So when it comes to how I got involved with the work of de-radicalization, I think it dates back to when I was working in reintegration in Sweden. So I did this from when I was 17 to around 25, and I developed the first sort of summer school for unaccompanied refugee minors in Sweden, where we looked at topics outside of the school curriculum. So it was everything from like self-development, dreams and visions, to sexual reproductive health, anything from job interviews to how you approach other people and different topics, and through different activities. And I think, just to keep a long story short, we had a couple of incidents where the boys that I worked with, when they end up in this sort of limbo of asylum application process, and then also for some of them it was declined, and during their deportation process that some were approached, radicalized, and then sort of went off the radar. So I think this really impacted my early kind of academic and professional path when it comes to then incorporating the countering violent extremism aspect to it, and then looking at de-radicalization and reintegration.
Interesting. And how come that you ended up where you are now?
So this was one of those junctions of that you come across in life at times, and it happened that while I was studying peace and development in Sweden for a bit, which also included looking at social sciences and different all these Browning's book on ordinary men and the Police Battalion 101, how ordinary men commit atrocities, Zimbardo's prison experiment, and everything when it comes to like different circumstances that could make anyone commit different acts. And I think during this time I ended up in Kenya by a bit of a coincidence to do some research specifically on the reintegration and community facilitation of that process. And since then it just went from there, and I kept coming back. So we became home from 2018, and then I started working regionally in Eastern Africa on terrorism prevention.
Wow, quite a long and diverse experience, Tina. From your personal perspective, based on this long and diverse experience, as I mentioned, Tina, what is the state of art in the field of de-radicalization and rehabilitation? What is your personal opinion about that?
Well, the state of the art, I think it's very interesting, because I have this privilege of looking into the, for instance, Eastern African context and also the European context. And I think when we look at obviously disengagement and de-radicalization speaks to different parts of the process. So the first being more the physical part of it, and then de-radicalization as such, also aligned with like international humanitarian law and freedom of expression and human rights. I think it needs to be more led by the individual. So I think we're looking at a bit of a tick box exercise sometimes, especially when it comes to donor relations and expectations. And there's been a lot of good work when it comes to good practices, but caution needs to be, when it comes to saying that anything is best practices, because it's so contextual. Some of my findings, for instance, point that, in a specific context, if the community where you are to be reintegrated into, if they hold radical sentiments, then de-radicalization is not necessary as part of your reintegration process. So this is one of the things to keep in mind that, as an example, that is very contextual and what is expected from the community as well. And if the radical sentiments are there, the de-radicalization is not necessary for your reintegration, for instance. So these kinds of aspects, just looking at it from a very contextualized, learning obviously from good practices elsewhere, but then that these are locally developed and informed as well.
Right. So bottom line, all these kind of interventions should be contextualized in order to take into account the family or the community features and so on, in order to make sense in that particular place and that particular time. So that's apart from that, are there any other learning points that you would take and you would like to share with the practitioners watching this video?
Learning points. I think part of my recent work has been moving beyond this sort of conventional way that we do, to inform policy, the research that we do, and we sort of tend to roll in the same sort of pattern that is depicted as good practice, and the data collection and everything is very conventional, semi-structured interviews, and there's always this bias of the individual who's engaged in any intervention. So for that reason, yes, learning of good practices from elsewhere, but then for it to be very locally led, it needs to be the participant led. And one of the examples that I've recently worked on is moving beyond this, the questions and answers kind of approach and fact finding, that we move towards more innovative approaches as part of forming reintegration policy and strategies. And for this, I worked with something I called intersubjective body mapping, which I can tell you more about as well. It's an artistic methodology that is very participant-led, because we don't use the questions that inherently hold a bias from from where they are being posed and with the objective, but looking at the reintegration process by using arts. So we've done this with victims of terrorism, with returnees, and also with the law enforcement and community members, for them to go through this, looking specifically at reintegration, not posing questions, more prompts, and in a workshop setting with the different groups and stakeholders respectively, where we've then, in practice, it starts with a clean canvas, blank canvas of 2 times 2 meters, where the participants then lay on the ground, outline their body, and then we start going through this internal experience as part of then looking at the collective. So there's going to be on this canvas sort of your outline of your body, you go through your internal experience, and then relate that to the sort of collective process of this as well. And for this, we look specifically at obviously the reintegration side of things. And I think that sort of the rationale behind this, and for instance, Van der Kolk has written a phenomenal book on how the body keeps the score, and how talk therapy can only do so much when it comes to processing different events and traumatic experiences. But there needs to be a mind-body work and a connection when you look at these fragmented sort of past, present, and future, and getting them onto a canvas using art gives the participant an opportunity to sort of observe it, their own experience, and go through it by observing their final product in a way. So as we piloted this, just to try it out, because we had the rationale and the theoretical framework behind it, and saw that this can be used looking at reintegration, we involved local actors. So we had county level, really grassroots civil society, victims of terrorism, returnees, and security actors as well. And then as they go through this, it's a way of processing trauma beyond words. They use colors, symbols, and different words as they develop these body maps. And it's also a way of bringing these different actors together, because obviously there's a lot of, it's a very, it's a crowded space sometimes when it comes to countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism, and seeing, what are the good practices and what works in this context. So bringing these together outside of this more conventional way of cooperation frameworks, and how do we, develop these plans to actually advance the dialogue beyond and look at what we identified as understanding and trust are important factors for the reintegration process, and how do we actually move beyond where we are currently to advance this dialogue so that we can inform reintegration strategies to be developed. So bringing them together and in respective sort of workshop settings, looking at, we had the same sort of structure of the prompts and looking at their experience of violent extremism and reintegration and different topics that we had, and then bringing them to see each other's work. So it's also a way of communicating. For instance, there was, even if there is a distinction between who's a victim of terrorism and who is a victim of extrajudicial violence, for instance. But bringing law enforcement, for instance, to see the victims' body maps and how it was fascinating to see how they didn't perceive this as criticism, as it could have been done in a dialogue, but rather the audience member observes and sees through the exhibitions that we had of these body maps, something that could be, criticism, but they actually take it in and reflect on, like, this exhibition tells me this and this and that, and it takes it beyond, the current discussion and what can be done about it afterwards, and actually internalizing this as constructive criticism and something that needs to be improved as well. And it also, in a way, moves beyond these like pre-held assumptions, because a lot of the frameworks that we work around when it comes to reintegration are very, shaped around, like I mentioned before, the bias, but also pre-held assumptions that returnees would feel a certain way about a victim of terrorism, and victims of terrorism in turn would feel a certain way about returnees. Whereas through this work that we did, it was fascinating to see how there's a lot more empathy from the side of the victims, for instance, towards the returnees, that the returnees would have otherwise not been aware of, which wouldn't have been able to be communicated in a dialogue and a guided session or mediation or reconciliation as such. But for this to be conveyed through arts for the interpretation of the receiving audience member who's seeing this exhibition. So it's a very innovative way of bringing together these different actors when it comes to looking at reintegration and taking it a step further.
I mean, it really sounds like you involve a range of different partners and to create the understanding from different perspectives, which really is helpful, I think, for a lot of European practitioners and policymakers to gain insights in. This is one of the themes that we're looking at currently within the round to kind of understand how should we work with both the kind of target group population, but also the receiving communities and the victims, and how do we address all these different factors. So very inspiring to hear. And on this, what thinking from what you shared now and the practice that you have, what would be your recommendations for policies on this?
For policies, again, contextual, and for these there's a lot of development from, I think there's a perception in some of the communities where I've worked that there's sort of a top-down development. We have guiding frameworks and also the obviously legal frameworks guiding the work when it comes to a very securitized topic as reintegration. But then advancing this to actually be, sort of a mutual exchange and learning from the grassroots. And I know that there's initiatives and value recognized in developing it with local actors, but then also including in this dialogue. I know it's because of the securitization of the topic of returnees and whether there's asylums in place or amnesties and how to engage returnees who are no longer in conflict with the law to inform these policies. So how do we actually learn from the first-hand people who have experienced, gone through this reintegration process or are still in the process of reintegrating, and how they would be then legally allowed to inform policy. So I know the legal context differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but I think this is something that needs a lot more sort of recognition and also advancing the participation of formers and also the returnees.
Yeah, Very interesting. And now coming back to the realm of possible and real, Tina, how do you see the progress in this field for the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think there's a lot of good work being done in a lot of different places, and this exchange of practice and learning more about these innovative approaches and using, you know, anything from sports and arts to different joint activities to bring together in this non-conflictual way of communicating and informing the policy development, but also the implementation. I think this being a very securitized topic, I think there's a lot to be looked at when it comes to empathy. So, for instance, we and yourselves, we work in the field of CVE for a reason, and the field of reintegration for our individual reasons, and we continue to do so. And then there's community members who are not affected by violent extremism or terrorism, who observe these as processes in the sort of periphery. But how do we engage these individuals as well? Because we keep talking about a holistic approach and a whole of society approach, but how do we then engage also the individuals who don't feel invested or as part of the dialogue, and who maybe don't even wish to be because they feel like it doesn't concern me. And then looking at the increase of empathy. So from radicalization to sort of a radical empathy, and how can we advance this notion of empathy in the communities for you know, forgiveness and reconciliation and moving forward from someone coming back, reintegrating into any given community, and then from there gaining the empathy of the surroundings as well. I think that needs to be a big part of the discussion in the coming years, and also looking at norm critique being one, and looking at the norms of a given context. So these obviously differ. We all, including, you know, different actors and community members, returnees, and law enforcement security actors, we have our norms and standards that we live by. But then how and can norm critique being introduced in all contexts, and how should we go about this in that case, looking at masculinity norms and lessons learned from elsewhere where norms are significantly different when it comes to, you know, masculinity and other norms that would play a part in reintegration. And I think this would be an important area to look at, and how to and can we introduce norm critique in different contexts.
This is very relatable, or what you share really with the discussions that we have in European and other contexts, so very helpful. If we think of somebody who is entering this field and starting to work with this population, what recommendations would you give? How would you guide, if you give a few kind of guiding directions, how would you do that?
I think it depends on where this individual is coming from. So is it a local actor entering the field, or is it someone from the outset entering with practices and lessons learned from elsewhere to introduce these in the context? So I think it depends on that a little bit, what the guidance would be.
So let's have a scenario when we think that a new staff in an organization is introduced to working with this a group from a local perspective. How could we guide that professional into this work?
I think that it starts with the listening and the learning. So as much as there can be lessons learned from elsewhere, entering a context with sort of a humble humility to learn from the context and understand the different dynamics, and the level of how securitized this topic is depends on the context and different actors and political dynamics, and also the legal framework. So I think it starts with the learning the context, if possible learning the language, depending if you enter in a different location, and local solutions to the challenges. I think that's one of the main and key sort of to be able to bring anything to the table, is first that understanding and the space for local solutions for the local challenges.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating dialogue, Tina. I think we learn quite a lot about the importance of listening and learning and looking for local challenges and local solutions. And in this respect, the approach that you described, the holistic approach that you described, involving the returnees, the foreign fighters, but also the victims, the communities, the law enforcement, and so on. I think it's really fascinating. It's an important learning point that we can take in Europe, but also to pay attention to the context and to how these solutions actually can be adapted and implemented into a specific time and place. I think it's really interesting. And we also learned quite a lot about the body mapping. We are looking forward to learn more, and empathy, non-criticism, masculinity, a lot of other important concepts that you mentioned and are really critical for understanding our field. So we would like to thank you very much. Asante sana.